So, what exactly is wrong with capitalism? This is the part where you may have to grit your teeth and sit through some things you don't want to hear. In America, we've gotten our self-identity so wrapped up in our economic system that we see capitalism and America as the same thing. Capitalism is our national identity, and therefore any criticism of capitalism is an attack on the nation itself. This should not be the case. An economic system is just one way to structure the monetary relations of a country. It's not a national culture. Capitalism is a tool which, in theory, should elevate the people of said country and materially improve their lives. Let's look at some examples of why this is no longer the case. We'll start with the most obvious problem: the massive discrepancy between worker and executive compensation and power. Your paycheck isn't actually based on how good a job you do. Not really. Your boss is in a position of power where he chooses which people to hire and which to fire.
So first of all, exploitation is something you're always going to have. You're never going to get rid of exploitation 100%, and it's only natural in this corporatist system you're going to be faced with some level of that. Secondly, he doesn't really understand what wealth is. You could look at, of course, before the internet, life back when mobile phones weren't really the done thing. You never really had the GPS system. People were going about with maps, etc. Mobile phones that allow people to keep in contact with the other end of the world, etc. and go onto the internet. In the presence of these big companies like Amazon, the amount of wealth they have created. There's so many products that you can buy. There's so many things you could touch upon in terms of people's material standards of living. That's what wealth is. Exploitation will always exist. To believe otherwise is just a myth. The best way to limit that problem is to create opportunity in the marketplace, to have strong consumer choice, to have strong competition, but of course, corporatism through all the socialist government interventionism limited just that.
The people that work for him produce goods or services which then become his property, and which he then sells to make a profit. Your paycheck is, in reality, determined by your minimum needs and your boss's requirements for labor power in the relation to the number of people competing for jobs.
So the problem with his argument, he doesn't acknowledge the fact that the workers working for that company are contributing in the production cycle, and then the products are then put there on the shelf. So the question is, who work for the company, who produce the goods, what is stopping them buying those goods? They now have, equal opportunity just as much as any consumer outside who doesn't work for the company to buy those goods. It's there on the shelves. There's nothing stopping them buying it. The idealistic and deeply flawed view of the socialist in this perspective, this isn't communal ownership. This would actually pertain to individual ownership, which contradicts everything that communal ownership stands for and basically Marxism. But if we were to go along with his argument for a second and say workers would then be able to own the means of their production, so that means that they would own whatever they produce. Right, okay, we'll just go along with that for a second. The problem with that argument is, if you produce something and then you own it, that means you're placing the consumer secondary because it's not on the shelf. It then means that the consumer is put into a position where they're going to have to try and persuade that individual who worked for it and owns it to give it up. What if that worker doesn't want to give it up because they now own it? The consumer is now going to have to try and persuade that individual to give it up. But that's individual ownership anyway. What's individual ownership got to do with communal ownership? He told you at the start that people don't understand the theory of Marxism, but then he's starting to go down the road of this idea that individuals get to work and own the fruits of their own labour. That isn't the communal ownership of the means of production. This is how you know that people like this don't even understand communism. They don't even understand socialism.
The more people who are unemployed, that is, the more people who are looking for jobs, the easier it is for companies to hire desperate poor people for minimum wage. In this way, unemployment in society is actually beneficial for capitalists.
Capitalism's got nothing to do with a minimum wage. Capitalism's about the free market economy. It's about the market regulating itself, being more productive, exporting your goods and services in trade for other countries to become dependent upon you for trade, which in turn, because of their demand and them becoming more reliant upon your money, your purchasing power of your money drives up as you're more productive and others become more reliant upon you in trade. Therefore, when your purchasing power drives up, this will drive your wages up. That's why Hong Kong was able to improve their wages without a minimum wage for more than 4 to 5 decades.
And having a large reserve of people ready to step in and work for minimum wage means that the average employee is always living in fear of losing their job. If you make a fuss, if you complain, if you try to get a union involved, there is always someone to take your place.
So like I said earlier on, folk, capitalists can easily replace the workers and employ cheap labour. Well, that's corporatism. He doesn't acknowledge the fact that the private sector has had its backside regulated out of it by government, and all that socialist government interventionism that has strangled capitalism half to death. He then has the audacity to sit there and tell you that that's capitalism. Honestly, folk, that they're never going to learn, and they're not interested in learning. They're not even interested in real-world solutions to problems. They're only interested in an agenda, and they haven't even got any real-world examples to give to you. That's the lack of their credibility.
To the capitalist, you are expendable, just another cog in the machine, to be replaced at their convenience. It is in your boss's interest to make your paycheck as small as possible, while increasing the prices of goods and services.
He doesn't acknowledge the fact that these minimum wage workers, forget the fact that minimum wage has nothing to do with capitalism, he ignores the fact that these are entry-level jobs. In other words, they're jobs to use as a stepping stone until you improve your skills and then you move up the ladder. He tries to make it sound as if it's all one. They're not supposed to get paid more. Besides, capitalism would improve their wages over a period of time anyway. Now, contrast that to people who are skilled labour. Capitalists have to compete for that. And in order to hold on to your skilled labour, you're going to have to compete for it. So you're going to have to pay them more wages. He doesn't tell you that, however. He just tries to lump it all as one.
This maximizes profits for him, but forces you to tighten your belt. When your boss pays you crumbs compared to what you could be making and your landlord raises your rent, that leaves you with a lower quality of life and less financial mobility.
Well, that seems to be the problem, socialist. You don't understand the laws of supply and demand. So of course if the landlord raises the rent costs, I'm not bloody well surprised. It's called the laws of supply and demand. That's what happens when demand far outstrips the supply available. So obviously price is going to drive up. So how do you rectify that problem? You try and control the immigration problem, don't you? Oh, but that's right. We're all racist now, aren't we? And then you have the audacity to think that you can stare straight past the laws of supply and demand and just say, well, it's all because of greed. It's nothing to do with greed. Welcome to the laws of supply and demand. The higher price means there's a shortage. It means that demand is far outstripping that of supply. Why is that? Because you've got far more people flooding into the country and demand of housing than that of what is actually available. You created the problem.
This all works out beautifully for the owner class. Their profits increase year after year. There is, however, a flaw in this system. Well, besides the blatant disregard for human life. Unemployed and poorly paid workers don't make for a profitable market. When workers are paid so little that they can barely afford rent, how could we expect them to buy goods and services on the market? Companies produce more and more consumer products, but what happens when the consumers can no longer afford the very goods their labor produces? This creates a snowball effect. Low wages and precarity lead to an unprofitable market.
If a company puts out products on the market, and let's say those products are expensive, and then let's say by your theory they're not earning enough in wages in order to buy those goods, what that simply would then mean, nobody would be buying that product. Do you know what that means? That means that that company that has expensive goods would have no choice but to reduce their prices of those goods that are too expensive because they're not selling them. If you're not selling produce that you've put out there in the market and the price is too high and nobody's buying it because they can't afford it, what that simply means is they're making losses. That tells you you don't even understand basic economics to do with losses. Because after all, you said yourself that, oh well, they don't have the wages to pay for it. So if they don't have the wages to pay for it, what's the company going to have to do? They're going to have to reduce their prices to match what the consumer is willing to pay for. Do you honestly believe a capitalist can just set any price they like, and if nobody's buying it, they're just going to sit there and happily just keep the price there at a high level that nobody can afford? What worth is that to the capitalist? It's not worth anything, is it? They're making losses because it's not selling.
An unprofitable market means that the production of consumer goods is limited, which inevitably leads to economic depression. Have you ever noticed how there seems to be an economic crisis like once every 10 years? Well, that's actually not by accident. These crises have been happening ever since the very beginning of capitalism.
Focus this thing again where they just keep on blaming capitalism. It's like I said earlier on, because of the boom and bust cycle was caused by the fixing of the interest rates, because if there's a shortage of savings in the economy, then interest rates should be high, because then it creates the incentive for people to save more. After all, there's a shortage of savings in the economy. However, if you step in with socialism and you try to control interest rates just like you try to control prices, and you artificially lower the interest rates, the shortage of savings goes nowhere. It's an economic reality. That's why the higher interest rates was there in the first place, so that people would save more. Now that you've artificially and you've used socialism to drive the interest rates down, you've created a problem. Because what happens when you lower the interest rates? Consumer demand drives up and they end up going out and borrowing more and spending more during a period when there's a shortage of savings. That's what creates the boom and then the bust. But somehow, capitalism got the blame for that. How on earth could you blame capitalism for that when capitalism is about leaving interest rates be to the laws of supply and demand? Maybe if you first understood the fundamental basics of economics, maybe then you would be able to make a rational critique of capitalism. But that's the thing, second thought. You're incapable of doing so.
This upward and downward motion of the market is known as the business cycle, boom and bust, yo-yoing from one extreme to the other every decade or so. The boom comes from accumulation of wealth. When prices go up and wages go down, companies make money. But if the people are squeezed too hard and the market becomes unprofitable, it then leads to a depression, businesses close, people lose their jobs, debts aren't paid, banks collapse, governments run out of money.
You do not acknowledge the fact that the Federal Reserve in 1922 used open market operations that then gave the Federal Reserve Central Bank the power to interfere in the market. That means it's anti-free market. That means it's anti-capitalist. Because again, capitalism's about the free market money. It's about the market itself being free to determine what our money is, determining what the ratio of the money is, and even the interest rates through the laws of supply and demand. But that's not what happened. In 1922, because of the open market operations, it gave the Federal Reserve the power to manipulate interest rates, to change the reserve ratios, and they were printing the fiat currencies. They, temporarily took free market money, the gold, away from, and we're printing fiat currency out of thin air. So in other words, through that of artificially lowering the interest rates, creating a boom, and through the printing of the fiat currency, that's what created the soaring inflationary problem and the boom, because they artificially lowered the interest rates, so people are rushing out there and borrowing and spending a fiat currency. The inflation stemmed from running the printing press. That's what created the inflation. That's what created your prices soaring out of control. That's why there was a serious problem. What's that got to do with capitalism? Capitalism's about free market money. It was about gold. That was your free market money. Where was the gold? It was taken away. It was fraudulently taken away. And you ignore that. You ignore that. You purposely ignore it, and you do it on purpose. You also ignore the fact that the currency was being printed. You also ignore the fact that the interest rates were being manipulated. And yet, again, capitalism gets the blame.